I've had stories like Amelia's recounted to me quite a few times that they had to sit through presentations twice in order to figure out what I'm saying, or had to read chapters twice and sentences twice or 3 times before they figured out. So I'll take this opportunity to apologize for all the turgid prose that I've inflicted on the world. But what I want to talk about here is something that I think picks up on what Jeff and Nelson talked about earlier on. And that's like, what do we know? What is the evidence about effective instruction? Now, this seems like a very basic question, but when we look at the history of policymaking in the United States and also in a number of other countries over the last 20 or so years, what we see is the preponderance of evidence-free policies, leading to evidence-free practices, leading to students who are not getting what they need in schools, leading to inequitable outputs in terms of what schools are doing. And so what I want to, as the title suggests, what I want to do is look at what do we know about high-impact educational responses to close the achievement gap. A lot of people talk about the achievement gap, but when you look at what has happened over the last 20 years, I think everybody in this room has a right to be really, really angry. Because what has happened has been a series of irresponsible policymaking, irresponsible policies. There's been irresponsibility on the part of a number of researchers who have misinterpreted research on reading, misinterpreted research on English learners, with the result that teacher morale has crashed in a number of school districts, with the result that the achievement gap is just as wide as it's ever been. And it's not that we don't have the research to direct us in the appropriate directions. We've chosen to stick our heads in the sand and avoid what Al Gore called inconvenient truths. And I'll give you some examples of that. Before I start, let me just kind of anticipate something that I'm going to talk a little bit about. How many people here have heard of the National Reading Panel? Okay. Can somebody, maybe just 1 or 2 people, volunteer to say what was your big takeaway, or what was the way that was interpreted by policymakers? What do you think of when you think of what the National Reading Panel recommended? Anybody remember back to the year 2000?
5 areas that we know are important for all to become literate.
Okay, so they talked about 5 different dimensions of reading. Anything else? Okay, what most policymakers took away from the National Reading Panel is that phonics is important. And not just phonics, but what they call systematic phonics. They didn't say very much about reading comprehension, but that conclusion of the centrality of phonics for effective reading instruction was picked up by the Bush administration's No Child Left Behind, and was turned into reading practices that have denied countless children, millions of children, opportunities to learn how to read. And I'll try and document that in a moment. But it goes back to, the kinds of things that I'm saying go back to the way we have turned research into policies that are ineffective and evidence-free. Okay, so I'll try and give you a pre-organizer of some of the things that I want to get into. Here are some of the major points. And the first one is what I've just said. A major reason why the achievement gap has remained large is that under No Child Left Behind, many of the policies we've implemented have been evidence-free. When we look at the development of reading comprehension, policymakers and also many researchers have largely ignored massive evidence that literacy engagement is a major determinant of how well students develop reading skills. Jeff mentioned that in his presentation earlier on this morning with the outcomes of the cohort study in the UK. And that's just one large-scale study, but it's not even the largest scale study pointing in this direction. The studies carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the so-called PISA studies, the Program for International Student Assessment, show this big time, as well as a massive number of other studies. In my presentation, which you'll get access to, there's a couple of slides at the end that list some of the research studies pointing in the direction of literacy engagement. Now, if I were to mention the term literacy engagement and ask you how many people here are aware of the research suggesting that literacy engagement is the major predictor of how well children are going to read, I suspect that probably some overachievers like Amelia would put up her hand, but most people have not heard of that. And that's because those findings have been essentially obscured, hidden, shoved off the table by both researchers and policymakers. In addition to literacy engagement, I'm going to talk about the roles of societal power relations and the way these power relations in the wider society get expressed in teacher-student identity negotiation. And again, if you look at the discourse on the achievement gap, if you look at the discourse on school improvement, you will very rarely see the word identity in there. And yet identity is a major construct in the area of applied linguistics and in the area of language learning. And yet the whole notion of identity and negotiation has not been part of mainstream policy discourse. So two things have been left off: literacy engagement and identity issues. And I'm going to suggest that both of these are central to talking meaningfully about closing the achievement gap. And we can identify evidence-based educational responses when we do three things that are painfully logical. First of all, we ask which groups are having difficulty in school. Secondly, what we know about the potential causal factors that are operating with these three different groups. And then what high-impact instructional initiatives are available to respond to these causal factors. So that's where I'm going, and I'll give you, you may not be able to see this unless you've got hawk-like eyes, but this is basically the big picture framework that I'll just briefly mention at this point. I'm going to suggest that when we look at, if we leave students who have special needs out of the picture for the moment, and look at the research, we find three different groups. They're overlapping in many respects, but three different groups that research suggests tend to experience academic difficulties. One of these are students coming from a home language background that's different from the language of the school, linguistically diverse students. That we know, again, I think as Jeff pointed out this morning, that socioeconomic status, SES, is a major determinant of underachievement. In most countries, there are significant gaps between students who are living in poverty with respect to achievement and students who are living in much more affluent circumstances. It's interesting because when you look at the OECD data, countries vary a lot in terms of the impact that socioeconomic status has, but it comes out as a very consistent finding. And then we have students from what could be called marginalized backgrounds, where their communities have experienced and are experiencing various kinds of discrimination in the wider society, sometimes going back for generations, sometimes going back for hundreds of years. We think of the Canadian context. First Nation students or Native Canadian students have experienced brutality in educational contexts like no other. If we look at the US context, African Americans, Latinos, Latinas, and Native Americans again have occupied a lower social status and have been the object of various kinds of discrimination and exclusion over many generations. So if we look at the sources of potential disadvantage in these three groups, and then look at what we know about evidence-based instructional responses, that's where I'm going. And obviously, in a number of cases, these three groups will be combined into one individual or a set of individuals. If we look at many students from Latino backgrounds, they're learning the language of instruction, they're living in poverty or low income backgrounds, and they've been subject to various kinds of discrimination over generations. So all three of those categories would be contained among many students from Latino backgrounds. But these are conceptually distinct. We can have, for example, a student who's learning English, let's say a student who's from a Romanian home background, whose parents are engineers. Their task is to learn the language of instruction. They're not from low socioeconomic backgrounds and not from marginalized status. So these are conceptually distinct categories. And when we look at the research in these areas, the research has tended to remain separate. We have researchers concerned with language issues and English as a second language issues, talking about linguistically diverse students. What do we need to do to teach kids the language of instruction? We have a number of very prominent researchers who've looked at socioeconomic status issues. Dave Berliner in Arizona being one of the most prominent. But generally, they don't extend that to looking at how SES issues combine with linguistically diverse issues. And then again, as I think both Jeff and Nelson alluded to this morning, we've got culturally responsive approaches to instruction, or culturally sustaining approaches that address some of the issues related to discrimination and marginalized status. But again, the people who are talking about that generally are not talking about issues related to linguistic differences between home and school. My point here is that we need to bring these three things together. It's not enough just to talk about effective ESL teaching strategies or scaffolding. We've got to talk about what we can do to address issues related to socioeconomic status and issues related to the causes of underachievement among students from marginalized backgrounds. All of those considerations have got to be together in the same classroom, in the same instructional approaches. So that's where I'm going, and I'll try and get there reasonably quickly. So I've divided it up into 6 segments. I may get through 4 of them. We'll see how the time goes. First of all, I want to give you some examples of evidence-free policies. Then I'll talk just very briefly about the nature of academic language and how it relates to literacy development. One of the reasons for doing that is that if we understand the nature of academic language, we can see immediately why literacy engagement is crucial, because we find academic language in 2 places. We find it in classrooms, and we find it in printed text. We don't find it in everyday conversation. We don't find much of it on TV. We don't find much of it in presidential debates. But we do find it in printed text and in classrooms. And so when we see that it's students who are not reading, who do not get engaged with reading, are not getting access to academic language, we can understand exactly why many of them do not do well academically. I'll talk about some of the research relating to the role of literacy engagement in promoting literacy skills. Then I'll go to that diagram looking at potential educational disadvantages and how schools can respond to these. I'll talk a little bit about identity issues and how they connect up with power relations. And then get to what does this mean for schools and teachers. Okay, a couple of examples of evidence-free policies, just to give you a sense of why you should be angry. I think one of the people in the audience earlier on this morning talked about the fact that we have to test students after 1 year. They get 1 year grace before they have to be hit with the standardized tests. And if the students who've had 1 year opportunity to learn English and catch up to grade norms, if they're not at grade norms after 1 year, then it's because of bad teaching. This is a bad school. It probably needs reconstitution. That's the logic underneath No Child Left Behind. And then I'll move on to another example. Failure to acknowledge that systematic phonics teaching is largely unrelated to reading comprehension after grade 1. That's what the National Reading Panel said. They didn't tell you that they said that, but that's what the data say. So, English language learning. So what we know from a lot of research, I think the reanalysis that I did back in 1981, it was published in 1981, I was probably one of the first to point this out, but there have been many studies since then, that at least 5 years is required to catch up academically to native speakers. And by contrast, conversational fluency is typically acquired more rapidly. Students can function in the language in everyday contexts within a much shorter time than the 5 years required to catch up. One of the reasons it takes 5 years to catch up is that native English speakers are not standing still waiting for second language learners to bridge the gap. Every year they're increasing their vocabulary knowledge, their reading skills, their writing skills. So bilingual students have to run faster in order to bridge the gap. And when we look at the data, and this is just one out of many, many studies that show this, in California, after the passage of Proposition 227 in 1998, most schools went towards an English-only instructional process. And researchers at the American Institute of Research in West Ed looked at what the effect of that was. And one of the findings they came up with was that after 3 years of English-only instruction, only 12% of English learners had acquired sufficient academic English to be redesignated as English proficient. They reported that during the period that No Child Left Behind was in place, during the period that only 1 year was given for students to catch up. And so we know that it's counterproductive and ethically irresponsible to interpret low English learner performance after 1 or 2 years of learning English as indicative of inadequate instruction. That's what the policies have done. And any teacher who's teaching in schools that have large numbers of English learners, emergent bilingual students who are trying to catch up academically is in a kind of martyrdom situation, because you are likely to be seen as an inadequate teacher because after 1 year your children have not caught up academically. That's the logic of what we've done. If we look at reading, so again, I'll go through this very quickly, but the National Reading Panel adopted a fairly narrow focus in terms of what constituted legitimate research, and only experimental and quasi-experimental research was considered, predominantly coming from a cognitive psychology perspective. One of the major findings that they broadcast was that, and this is a quote, there's strong evidence that substantiating the impact of systematic phonics instruction on learning to read. Then $6 billion of tax money was spent on the Reading First program, and that predominantly funded programs that incorporated only an intensive focus on phonics in the early grades. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples of what they didn't fund in a moment. But this was, Reading First was basically put together by people with a University of Oregon direct instruction focus. That was, I guess, a transmission approach that Jeff talked about, transmission approach on steroids. And that was what they focused on. You had to get funded to get a chunk of this $6 billion. You had to have an intensive phonics-only, preferably scripted program in place. In New York, this is the example that I was thinking of. They had a program in place in New York City called Month by Month Phonics. So it was obviously a heavy-duty phonics program, but that was what it was trying to do. And the Reading First panel rejected this because it wasn't scientifically proven. These were the terms that they like to use. And it wasn't scientifically proven because it included classroom libraries and also an emphasis on writing. So this building would have been burned to the ground if they knew about it. The other point that I want to make in terms of reading, all of the analyses that were done by the National Reading Panel and then later by the National Literacy Panel that looked at language minority students and youth, they basically said, well, you know, voluntary reading doesn't really matter. There's no real research evidence that it's important. There's only a few studies that looked at this, so we don't need to worry about that. So they ignored the role of print access and literacy engagement, despite the fact that there is extensive research documenting its impact on reading comprehension. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. What the National Reading Panel actually showed was that there was no relationship of systematic phonics instruction to reading comprehension beyond grade 1. It did relate to decoding skills at grade 1. It did relate to reading comprehension at grade 1, not surprisingly, because if you can't decode you don't understand. So at that stage, it's not surprising there would be a relationship. But for normally achieving readers and for low achieving readers, the impact of phonics instruction rapidly reached a point of diminishing returns after grade 1. So there was no relationship. This was an article by the people up there, Airy, Noon, Stahl, and Willis, that came out in Review of Educational Research. They said among the older students in 2nd through 6th grades, phonics instruction was not effective for teaching spelling or teaching reading comprehension. And then readers in 2nd through 6th grade, classified as low achieving, revealed no overall effects of phonics instruction. These findings they were reported, these are quotes, but they were basically buried. The title of their article, which was reviewing this aspect of the National Reading Panel, was Systematic Phonics Instruction Helps Students Learn to Read. But it could probably more accurately have been titled Systematic Phonics Instruction Does Not Help Students Develop Reading Comprehension Beyond Grade 1, because that's what they found. How many people knew that? The reason that most of you didn't know that was because it was buried. It was buried systematically and intensively, like the phonics that you're supposed to use. So what happens when we implement evidence-free policies? We waste a huge amount of money. The Reading First Impact Study, which was a study set up by the federal government to figure out what did $6 billion buy, found that Reading First did not produce a statistically significant impact on student reading comprehension test scores in grades 1, 2, or 3, so it bought nothing as far as reading comprehension. It produced a positive and statistically significant impact on decoding among first grade students tested in one school year, so it wasn't even that successful for decoding. And then it had no statistically significant impacts on student engagement with print. Imagine if that $6 billion had been spent on buying classroom libraries or buying books for kids to read during the summer. Would have had a huge impact, far beyond what it had. Okay, so what these policies achieved was a major escalation of standardized tests, which has narrowed the curriculum and increased the pedagogical divide between schools serving low-income and more affluent students. Many students serving low-income students have cancelled recess and implemented instruction that focuses primarily on test preparation. Teacher morale in many of these schools is extremely low, and teachers will move to less challenging or higher socioeconomic status schools when they get the opportunity. And so what this means is that we have a revolving door in terms of teachers teaching in challenging schools. In other words, schools that are tough to teach in, where students are not doing well academically, where you know that you're going to be under scrutiny because of the test scores are going to be the focus, where you've got a lot of students who are learning English and they're supposed to do it within 1 year, and if they don't, it's your fault because you're a bad teacher. This is the logic underlying what we've done. And so, not surprisingly, in a lot of urban districts, there are looming teacher shortages. Here's just a little extract from an article Jonathan Kozel wrote a few years back. He documented the frustration of teachers of low-income students in the States who are, this is a quote, pressure to conform to teaching methods that drain every bit of joy out of the hours that their children spend with them in school. And he quoted one first-grade teacher who said, "I didn't study all these years to turn black babies into mindless little robots, deny the normal breadth of learning, all the arts and sciences, all the joy in reading literary classics, all the spontaneity and power to ask interesting questions that kids are getting in the middle-class white systems." So how do we get to a place where the accountability structures we've set up have, in fact, constricted the possibilities of inspirational teachers rather than promoting it? And I know that among the group here, many of you are teaching in challenging schools and are doing incredible work, but you're doing it in spite of the system rather than because of it. And that's not the way policy is supposed to work. Okay, very quickly, I just want to move on to the second segment to flesh out a little bit this distinction between everyday conversational fluency in the language and academic language proficiency. Because if we are talking about promoting academic language proficiency, closing the achievement gap, we need to understand a little bit about what we're talking about. Everyday conversational fluency, we're talking about the ability to interact in a face-to-face situation. In a face-to-face situation, there's all kinds of clues to the meaning, in addition to just the language itself. There's eye contact, facial expressions, intonation, all of which convey meaning. So in that kind of situation, imagine if you're in a foreign country and you have just a little bit of knowledge of the language, you can kind of figure out through gestures and through other cues what the person is saying to you, or that you can communicate because of those familiar face-to-face cues. We're talking about the kind of language that the vast majority of native speakers in any country, any situation, develop by the time they enter school at around age 5. We're talking about the use of high-frequency words and relatively simple grammatical constructions. You don't find a lot of 5-year-olds using the passive voice, for example. And when we talk about English learners, we're talking about students who are typically within one or 2 years on average, and this is a ballpark figure, there'll be big variation in this, but they're beginning to function pretty well in everyday face-to-face situations. If they're a younger student, they've probably picked up the phonology that they're hearing around them, and so they may sound like native speakers. Academic language, we're talking about something very different, and empirically very different. We're talking about knowledge of the less frequent vocabulary of English, as well as the ability to interpret and produce increasingly complex written language. As I said, at least 5 years is typically required to catch up. And again, as I said before, because it's found primarily in books, extensive reading is crucial in enabling students to catch up. If students are not reading, they're not getting access. And then frequent writing, there's less research, less quantitative research done on this, but frequent writing across genres, I think, is also crucial in developing academic writing skills. Just to illustrate what I mean by academic language, this is an extract from grade 5 social studies program. It was published by a long defunct publisher called Scott Forsman that was gobbled up by various other bigger sharks. But this was from a unit on the American Revolution. If you think about amend, annexation, dissolved, induced, when was the last time that anybody here used any of these words with your friends? Okay. Maybe if you've got teenage kids, you might have said, amend your ways, young man. But that's the only example I can think of. If you use these words on Facebook, you will be unfriended very quickly. But this is the reality of what kids need to learn. These are grade 5 kids that are supposed to figure out these words. So we're talking about, just at the level of vocabulary, very different kinds of challenges for kids. And if we get into discourse structures and get into grammatical features, then clearly the differences are equally evident. Okay, so why is literacy, or how is literacy engagement important? What research is there out there? There's a huge amount. Jeff mentioned some of it in his presentation, but let me just give you a little bit more of the data. The logic is up there, which I've talked about. The empirical case for seeing literacy engagement as a key determinant of literacy attainment comes from numerous studies, hundreds of studies, carried out over the past 30 years. Steve Krashen, in his book, The Power of Reading, reviewed these. Jim Lindsay carried out a meta-analysis of 108 studies that he kind of extracted from about 11,000 articles and studies carried out related to this issue. And then the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, their PISA studies, the Program for International Student Assessment, has some really interesting data relating to these issues. PISA involves at this point, about 70 countries. It looks at 15-year-olds, and it looks at their achievement in reading, science, and mathematics, as well as 1 or 2 other areas. And there's a wealth of data that they've come up with that relate to some of the issues we're talking about. Research, for example, carried out by Nell Duke and Newman and Solano and various others have shown repeatedly that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds have less access to print in their homes, neighborhoods, and schools than is the case with higher SES students. It's not surprising if you're trying to put food on the table and you're not sure if you've got enough money to buy food for the next couple of days, you're not going to be looking at books to buy. Okay? You don't have the money to buy iPads. And then when we look at the effects of summer reading, and in the little bookstore inside there are a couple of books focusing on summer reading, that also strongly supports the importance of literacy engagement. It's estimated, for example, that about 80% of the achievement gap between low socioeconomic background students and higher socioeconomic background students is accounted for by the loss of reading skills among low SES students during the summer months over the elementary school years. And so what Decolonizing and others have, and Steve Krashen and others have talked about, is if we can get students reading during the summer, that can offset some of the losses that students experience. So what are we talking about when we talk about literacy engagement? I've adapted these three categories from some of the work of John Guthrie, who's somebody who has done a lot of work in this. When we're talking about the amount and range of reading and writing, we're talking about use of effective strategies for deep understanding of text. And again, go back to what Jeff talked about earlier on this morning. You saw what that can do and what demystifying these strategies can do in terms of enabling students to get deeper into a text and get more satisfaction from it. And then we're talking about, these are my words rather than John Guthrie's, but positive affect and identity investment in reading and writing. And a lot of this is common sense, as Guthrie points out in the quote that's underneath there. He notes that in all spheres of life, whether we're talking about driving a car, doing brain surgery, playing golf, gourmet cooking, etc., participation is key to the development of proficiency or expertise. He says certainly some initial lessons are valuable for driving a car or typing on a keyboard, but expertise spirals upward mainly with engaged participation. And his point is, it's exactly the same with literacy. Okay, let's take a look just at the OECD's PISA study. What they have shown consistently over the last 15 years is that the level of a student's reading engagement is a better predictor of literacy performance than his or her socioeconomic background, indicating that cultivating a student's interest in reading can help overcome home disadvantages. John Guthrie picked up on these data and also the data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress and some other findings. And the way he expresses this is that the PISA data shows that students whose family background was characterized by low income and low education, but who were highly engaged readers, substantially outscored students who came from backgrounds with higher education and higher income, but who themselves were less engaged readers. Based on a massive sample, this finding suggests the stunning conclusion that engaged reading can overcome traditional barriers to reading achievement, including gender, parental education, and income. So if it's so obvious and so clear, how come people don't know about this? It's not that people haven't been publicizing it. John Guthrie is a highly respected cognitive psychologist, but it's just been ignored. And this is the finding down at the bottom that really blows my mind. Because what the OECD has found is that there's about a 1/3 overlap between the negative effects of low socioeconomic status and the positive effects of reading engagement. Expressed differently, what this implies is that we could push back about 1/3 of the negative effects of socioeconomic status if we could get kids reading actively and enthusiastically from the day they walk into school. Not just reading from the day they walk into school, but engaged with books, engaged with talking about stories, talking about stories that are read to them. And yet, what did Reading First do? They punished school districts that wanted to promote reading engagement. They threatened to deprive the New York City schools of about $50 million worth of funding because they had classroom libraries. So, evidence-free policies on steroids. And you saw the results, $6 billion flushed down the drain. Let me just give you an example of the kind of superficial analysis that has gone into some of this work on reading, or some of this interpretation of research. I'm going to talk a little bit about a chapter by Isabel Beck and Tim Shanahan in this book, Developing Literacy in Second Language Learners. This was the report of the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth. It was published in 2006. It's a wonderful book if you're a researcher, because it's got a wealth of studies reviewed there. Its conclusions and some other aspects of it are I'm less enthusiastic about. But as a document, it's an important accomplishment. But when we look at what, don't worry about the text there, I've just put it up to remind me, and when you get the PowerPoint, you can read it in more detail. But Beck and Shanahan looked at a number of factors relating to the development of literacy in second language learners. And one of the studies that they looked at was by a New Zealand reading researcher who's been around for a long time, Warwick Ellie, and Francis Nangubai, who is from Fiji. And they did a study that looked at the effects of what they called a book flood. So immersion of children in books. In 1983 they published it. So in Fiji, students were learning English as an additional language, and in a couple of, in grade 4 and grade 5, in a couple of schools, they looked at the effects of immersing students in books in English, rather than just teaching them the more formal curriculum in English. What they found was that immersion of children in books was far more effective, not just in developing reading comprehension skills, but other aspects of English proficiency also. When Shanahan and Beck looked at this, they said, well, we don't really believe these data, because where is it? They largely dismissed the findings because of what they claim are reporting flaws in the study. For example, they claim it was not possible to tell whether the pretest was in the student's native language or English, and the author didn't document what was done to account for attrition over the 2 years of study. It's very clear to me that neither of these authors read the actual study, because they don't reference the original Ellie and Mangubai study. They've looked at a summary by Ellie of 9 studies that were carried out on book reading. And it's very clear that all testing, when you do read the original work, it's very clear that all testing was carried out in English, including the pre-test measures, and attrition was not an issue because it wasn't a longitudinal study. The grade 4 and grade 5 students were tested independently. So that is kind of a replication study rather than a longitudinal study. So this is the kind of superficial analysis that goes for research synthesis. And this is one of the reasons why most people here have not heard that literacy engagement is what we need to focus on in teaching literacy skills. Okay, this is just a little framework that I've sometimes used as sort of an entry point to what the research is saying. I see it as being useful as a heuristic to start discussion at among educators within schools. So what this is saying is that the strongest predictor of literacy achievement is print access and literacy engagement. These are two sides of the same coin, obviously. If students don't have access to print, they're not going to get engaged with print. In order to get second language learners engaged with print, we need to scaffold meaning, both input and output. As both Nelson and Jeffrey mentioned this morning, we need to connect instruction to students' lives. This goes beyond just activating their prior knowledge. Sometimes, like the direct instruction folks will say, well, yeah, we believe in activating prior knowledge. What they mean is we remind kids what they learned in the lesson before, when we start the next lesson. What we're talking about here are tapping into the funds of knowledge that students are bringing, tapping into their cultural knowledge, involving parents. And again, we heard extremely good examples of that this morning, both with respect to language practices and as well as cultural knowledge and what's of interest to students. Affirming identity is crucial. And then extending language, explicit demystification about how academic language works. Again, that includes the kind of strategy instruction that Jeff talked about, as well as focusing on meta-linguistic aspects. Now, when we look at this in terms of mainstream educational discourse, what's been left out of mainstream educational discourse is any reference to literacy engagement and any reference to identity issues and affirming identity. And so it's not surprising that the achievement gap has not lessened. So a logical way of talking about or looking at what we need to be doing in schools would be to ask three very simple questions. Which groups of students underachieve? Why do they underachieve? What causal factors are operating? And then what do we know about ways of addressing the causal factors that are operating, or potential causal factors? Unbelievably, this process has not happened, to my knowledge. We have not systematically looked at who's underachieving. We know that there's been a lot of talk about, okay, students from African American backgrounds are not doing well, there's students from Latino backgrounds are not doing well. But we haven't put that together. We haven't looked at those issues at the same time as we're looking at issues related to socioeconomic status, and at the same time as we're looking at issues related to language differences. So the diagram that I showed you before, I guess this is the same thing, is back up here again. So if we look at sources of potential disadvantage, when we're talking about students who need to learn the language of instruction, the source of potential disadvantage is very clear. If students don't learn the language of instruction, or if they have difficulties learning that, they're going to fall further and further behind. Okay, so in terms of what we do to address that, there's considerable agreement on at least two of the three categories there. We scaffold comprehension and production of language across the curriculum. I think everybody agrees that that's important. The bottom one, reinforcing academic language across the curriculum. Again, there's agreement in principle for that, but it's sometimes a little superficial, because if we look at teacher education programs, very few of them, including the one that I've been affiliated with in Toronto, very few of them see teaching bilingual students and students learning the language of instruction as a job for the regular classroom teacher. It's a job for the language specialist. So in Toronto, you can get or in Ontario, you can get an additional qualification that qualifies you to be an ESL teacher. But if I'm a science teacher at grade 7, if I'm language arts teacher in grade 2 or grade 3, the implication is I don't need to know that, because somebody else is going to deal with it. So even though all of the people who've done research on this issue would agree, and they're all consistent in saying we need to reinforce language right across the curriculum. When we're teaching science, we're also teaching the language of science. We need to scaffold, teachers need to know how to scaffold students' comprehension of what we're teaching. It's done in a very spotty, sporadic way. And then engaging students' multilingual repertoires. Nelson, I think, brilliantly showed what that might look like in our classrooms this morning. And I'll give you some examples later on. That's less accepted, the attitude, which is beginning to change, but the attitude has been that, well, I don't speak any of the 15 different languages in my classroom, so I wish kids well in developing their language, but I'm going to treat it with benign neglect, okay? So English is the default language of instruction. Moving on to socioeconomic issues. These are some of the things that people like Richard Rothstein and Dave Berliner and others have talked about. Some of the sources of potential disadvantage. And I'm saying these are potential disadvantages because they only become realized as educational disadvantage when the school fails to do its job, or when the society fails to do its job. But inadequate healthcare and or nutrition, housing segregation, lack of cultural and material resources in the home due to poverty, inadequate access to print in home and school. Like, one of the things that Berliner and Rothstein and others talk about is the influence of lead. Students are living in project housing. There's lead paint all over that breaks off. Little toddlers chew on that, and it doesn't do their brains any good. This is the kind of thing that schools can't do very much about directly. But when we look at what schools can do something about, we can do a lot about print access and literacy engagement. We can do a lot about reinforcing language. We can't do much about housing segregation, at least within the individual school. But what we can do, as I said, is maximize access to print and maximize students' opportunities to get engaged with literacy. One of the reasons I'm delighted to be here is because that's exactly what this company stands for and what you've been doing, so congratulations. But you're the exception rather than the rule, as you know. And then, so if we move to students from marginalized status, there's the sources of potential disadvantage involve various kinds of discrimination within the wider society that we're all familiar with. These have translated in the past into low teacher expectations. The phenomenon of stereotype threat is kind of interesting. It's a label that came about from studies that a psychologist called Claude Steele was involved in back in the 90s. And what he showed from hardcore experimental research was that when stereotypes about a particular group are communicated to them, then task performance declines. So one example of a study that he did was or colleagues of his did, was to look at Asian women, and these presumably would have been university undergraduates. But in one treatment, he told them that the purpose of the study was to look at why it is that females are not as good at math as males. This is a stereotype that's out there. Why do we have so few female engineers, etc. And under those conditions, the women involved in the study didn't do very well on math tasks. But when the researchers told the group that the reason we're doing this study is because we know that Asians are much better at math than European background people, and we're trying to figure out just exactly why that is. When that stereotype, that positive stereotype was communicated to students, performance jumped. And there's all kinds of other examples of that. So when we look at the relevance of this, is that when we look at groups that have been stigmatized in the wider society, when stereotypes exist about their performance, when stereotypes exist about the variety of English that they bring to school, or their lack of English, then what we've done in the past is communicate those stereotypes to students, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes directly. Performance drops. So there's a pervasive pattern of identity devaluation happening in contexts where students are on the wrong end of coercive power relations in the wider society. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, we do the kinds of things that Jago Paris and Gloria Latson-Billings and Geneva Gay and others have talked about with culturally responsive or culturally relevant instruction or culturally sustaining instruction. And we challenge the stereotypes that exist in the wider society. So we connect instruction to students' lives. We decolonize curriculum and instruction, and I'll say a word about that in a moment. And we affirm students' identities in association with literacy engagement. So we basically communicate expectations and provide support that enables students to gain expertise, and the more they gain expertise, the more they get reading, the more they carry out projects that reflect their abilities, the stronger their academic development will progress. So when we're talking about decolonizing instruction, this comes up obviously in context of in post-colonial contexts, where in colonies, for example, the British Empire or French colonies, the superiority of the colonial masters was taken for granted, and the indigenous groups were on a very much lower status. And many of the minority groups that have not done well academically, who've been marginalized, discriminated against, have had the status of internal colonies. As an example, if you look at social studies materials in Canada relating to First Nations or Indigenous communities, what they've done up to this point, for the most part, is have great units in grade 4, 5, and 6, talking about how wonderful the relationships were between the First Nations, the Indigenous communities, and the first European settlers, how they cooperated, the settlers bought the fur that the Indigenous communities were hunting, so it was a wonderful little utopia there. It doesn't mention genocide, it doesn't mention slaughter, it doesn't mention the destruction of identity, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, the psychological abuse that went on over 120 years in residential schools. So we sanitized the curriculum. So what a decolonization process would do is take those issues out of the closet. Okay. So, moving on to segment 5, which is basically that last column, that third column there. If identity devaluation is a core factor in terms of why students from marginalized communities have not done well academically, how do we reverse that? I think Gloria Ladson-Billings, who was mentioned earlier this morning, put her finger on it, talking about African American students. She said the problem that African American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. This is a young woman from a First Nations background in Southern Ontario, and we had the opportunity to observe some of the work that these high school kids were doing in terms of art and poetry. And here's something that she said in talking with us. She said, take away identity and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think they care about what goes on in the classroom? And I think that puts, she puts her finger on it very precisely. So this is, again, some repetition here, but when we look at the research in these issues, one of the reasons that it hasn't been picked up in the policy world is because it's qualitative research. It's ethnographic studies. It's sociological studies. It's if anybody can come up with a standardized test to measure identity, please let me know. And so it's just been dismissed. But there's a huge amount of anthropological work, sociological work that points in this direction, as well as hardcore psychological work, experimental work that people like Claude Steele have done on stereotype threat. So what do we do? One strategy that a number of teachers across Canada have been using recently is when we're talking about bilingual students who are learning English, enable them to write in 2 languages. This is a story from a student who came from Israel. He was in grade 6 when he did this, called Tom Goes to Kentucky. He had come from, his father had worked in agricultural settings in Israel, and Tomer was very familiar with horses and loved horses. So the Kentucky in the story is a reference to the Kentucky Derby. But what he did in this was to write initially in Hebrew. There was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew who could help him translate it into English. And so then he published and illustrated a dual language story that is part of the classroom library. It's up on the web, it's been read by thousands of people. He's emailed his friends back in Israel, check out my story. And the ironic thing is that if you had given him his story before he wrote it in English, he could not have read it. After he wrote it, he could read it. And this is an example of what some people, Courtney Casson, for example, I think was the first to use this phrase, called performance precedes competence. And again, we learn by doing, as was I think expressed by Jeffrey this morning. Here's another story written by 3 students from Pakistan, Madiha, Sulmana, and Kanta. Sulmana and Kanta had been in Canada for about 3.5 years. They were in grade 7 when this was done. This was a culminating project in a unit on immigration that they had been looking at. All of the students in the class were from English as a second language or third language backgrounds, but they're learning content in what's sometimes called a sheltered context. However, Madiha had just arrived. She'd been in the country about 6 weeks before they started this. And so if you had a writing project for a student like Madiha, you might have been able to pull 1 or 2 painful sentences out of her in English. If the classroom was an English-only zone, she's shut out. But what the teacher did, she made it clear that she was very happy for students to use their first languages. And the students suggested that they write a story connected to the unit on immigration about their own immigration experiences. They called it The New Country. And they discussed the story initially in Urdu with Mediha, a full participant. They figured out what the storyline was going to be. They invented a composite character called Sonia and injected experiences that all three of them had into that. They figured out what the illustrations were going to look like on each page, what the text was going to look like. So all of that planning was done in a language that they had in common. Then they would first draft in English, conference with the teacher about it, got feedback, and then when they finalized the English version, they went back to Urdu and translated from the English back into Urdu. When you look at the videotapes that we've got, you see them talking about metalinguistic issues. How do you say that in Urdu? No, that's not the right word. I've forgotten that word. I need to go home and I'll check with my mom what how you say this. I'm going to let you listen to Kanta, who I think is very insightful about what this kind of project meant for her and for her friends.
Hi. We're going to start by introducing Kanta, who's going to tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, my name is Kanta. I'm from Pakistan. My first language was Punjabi, my second language was Urdu, and my third language was English. I came here in grade 4, and now I am in grade 9.
How did you feel writing the book in 2 languages, and how did you see it helping you or the others?
It helped me a lot, and using 2 languages helped us a lot to understand English better. And for Madiha, who was actually new here, and then like in Urdu, if you would write, you would say 3 words. In English, you would actually have to write 5 words. So then, if you're thinking Urdu, you would be only writing those 3 words, and then so those sentence structures didn't really make sense. But while we were doing it, it made a lot of sense to her. And then how it helped me, it helped me that when I was here and when I came here in grade 4, the teachers didn't know what I was capable. I was given a pack of crayons and a coloring book and to get on coloring with it. And then after, I felt so bad about that. I am capable of doing much more than just doing that. I have my own inner skills to show the world than just coloring. And then I felt like those skills of me were important also. So when we started writing these books, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just coloring. And then, so that's how it helped me, and then it made me so proud of myself that I am actually capable of doing something, and here today I am doing something like that, that I can actually show the world that I'm just not a coloring person. I can actually show you that I am something.
What she's saying is supported by a huge number of studies that have been totally ignored outside of academic contexts. And so basically when you hear somebody like Cassandra earlier on and Kanta talk about issues of identity, it brings home in terms of our own experiences. And yet we have shoved all of that outside of mainstream discourse and school improvement. One of the terms that colleagues of mine and I have used to talk about this whole issue is the notion of identity text, which refer to artifacts that students produce. They take ownership of these artifacts as a result of having invested their identities in them. And you saw that from how Kanta talked about this. And then once produced, these texts, which they don't have to be written, they could be spoken, they could be visual, they could be dramatic, they could be musical, or combinations in multimodal form. They hold a mirror up to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. And so they invest their identities in this text, which then kind of act as ambassadors for who they are and who they can be. So they're likely to receive positive feedback and affirmation of self in interaction with various audiences. And so with the technology we have right now, we can put this stuff up on the web. We can communicate across vast distances in terms of students' work. So we have the means to do this in a much more amplified way than we did before. So let me just wrap up by looking at what some of this might look like in a school context. And a lot of this will overlap with things that Nelson talked about earlier on this morning. This is a chart, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it's just a way of thinking about some of the issues that we know are important. Things like literacy engagement, how do we communicate content, how do we scaffold content, how do we ensure that the instruction is at a cognitive challenge level rather than a low level cognition, how do we use various kinds of technological and other tools, how do we assess in ways that promote learning rather than constrict learning, what's our orientation to students' language and culture, is the message students are getting, leave your culture and your language at the school has stored, this is an English only zone, or if we don't believe that, then what do we do about it? And then parental involvement. So we can look at where we are now as a school community, where would we like to be, what's our identity as an educator or as educators, what kind of education do we want to be making available to our students, and then how do we move in that direction. So if we look at some of this is basically taking you through a little walk through a school that I did one afternoon. It's an elementary school in the Toronto area. And one of the teachers had this sentence starter, reading makes me powerful because. And students had written and typed up various kinds of responses to that. This is just one of them. The responses were posted outside the classroom. So Tasneem says, reading makes me powerful because when I grow up, I can find a better job than people who can't read. Somebody can also trick you to do something that will get you into trouble. If you have low literacy skills, you're vulnerable. Reading gives you new words to learn. It gives my brain new ideas. It helps your vocabulary, so when you need to write something, you can use longer and harder words. In school, you can get a better mark using more words. So I'm sure Tasneem at this point is probably CEO of some hot startup company because she's got it all figured out. But look what this is doing. This is very clever, very simple sentence starter. Reading makes me powerful because is linking up identity and literacy. This is a photograph of the part of the school library where there are multiple books in languages other than English. There are dual language books as well as languages that are represented in the community. This school is an inner city school. It gets some additional funds because it's an inner city school. One of the ways it spends these funds is to keep the school library open for 4 days a week between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock so that parents can come in. There's a lot of high-rise buildings around the school. Parents can come in, they can read books with their kids, they can check out books in English or books in their home language to bring home with them. This is exactly what the research is saying. And yet, this is not happening in a large majority of schools. So rather than spending a lot of money on books that will have phonics intensive and systematic phonics instruction right through grades 1 to 6, why not do something like this? It's what the research is saying. What we're doing in many schools is evidence-free. This is the sign for the office. The school district, the Toronto District School Board will provide any school that requests it the signs for the office in multiple languages. Again, on the walls, I guess when I was there, the schools were doing a lot of work on character development issues, and you probably can't see that, but it says it's talking about, in Spanish, it's talking about empathy. So it talks about what empatia is in Spanish. This is a different school, another elementary school in the Toronto area, where the teacher, it was an ESL class, it was grade 4. The teacher had students work in language-specific groups to look at characteristics of English and their home language, and they're alike and different. Again, it ties in directly with the meta-linguistic orientation that Nelson talked about. A different school, grade 7. This was during the American election, 2008, quite a long time ago. But this was a student from an Arabic-speaking background who looked at some of the Arabic media in terms of what their take on what Obama was going to do, whether he was going to make any difference in the Middle East or not. And then the student writes it up and shares with his or her classmates. The Dual Language Showcase, which you can find on the web, it goes back to 2002. It was created by a grade 1 and 2 teacher, Pat Chow, in Thornwood Public School. All of these languages, there's about 28 languages there. I think there are more than what I've got here. They've got a variety of books that kids have written. They either write them in English first and then work with their parents on a first language version, or new parents can write in their first language and then go to English. And they're up on the web. Going back to the original school, Crescenttown, in the library, this is what you see. Examples or showcasing of critical inquiry work that students have done on real issues. And again, when students walk into the library, when they walk into the library with their friends, with their parents, they are part of this project. This is a mirror that reflects them in a positive light. A teacher who did had his students do a survey of the languages in the school for a data management unit in grade 5. So these are some of what they came up with in terms of the languages that grade 5 kids were speaking. So the fundamental principle that underlies all of this is very simple. If you want students to emerge from schooling after 12 years as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented, then treat them as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented from the first day they arrive in school. It's very simple, but it's challenging patterns of power relations in the broader society. That's not the way that students from certain marginalized groups have been treated historically. So thank you.